Step away from my son. The words struck Elliot Vanderbilt like a thunderbolt, freezing the billionaire CEO as he gently wiped chocolate frosting from young Ethan's face with his silk pocket square. Behind the boy, Kira Thompson, his former love, stood stunned, her dark eyes wide with protective fury. Welcome to Golden Heart Narratives, where stories ignite the soul. Where are you listening from today? Drop your city in the comments and share your guess. Will this chance encounter at a wedding spark a new beginning or unravel old wounds? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch our latest tales of love and redemption. What secrets lie in Elliot and Kira's past? Why did she vanish 5 years ago? Join us as we unravel a story of heartbreak, hope, and second chances that will leave you wondering, could a single moment change everything? The vineyard stretched endlessly before Elliot Vanderbilt, its rows of gnarled vines bathed in the amber glow of a California sunset. The wedding reception hummed with life. Laughter spilled from clusters of guests, glasses clinked in toasts, and a jazz quartet spun sultry notes into the warm evening air. Yet Elliot stood apart, a solitary figure in a tailored navy suit, his blonde hair catching the fading light like a halo he didn't deserve. His piercing blue eyes, sharp enough to intimidate boardrooms, scanned the scene with calculated detachment. He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. 6:32 p.m., 28 minutes. That's all he needed to endure to fulfill his obligation to the groom, his old college friend, Daniel. Then he could escape back to his San Francisco penthouse, where silence reigned and emotions were locked away, as cold and unyielding as the steel in his skyscraper office. Elliot adjusted his cufflinks, the third time in 10 minutes, each movement precise, a ritual to anchor himself in a world that felt increasingly foreign. He was a billionaire CEO, master of a tech empire he'd clawed from nothing, a man who bent markets and moguls to his will. But here, amid the swirl of joy and connection, he was an outsider. Relationships he'd decided long ago were liabilities, messy, unpredictable, and far too costly for a man who measured success in profit margins and market shares. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after it had nearly derailed him 5 years ago. He pushed the memory down, bearing it with the same ruthlessness he used to crush hostile takeovers. "Elliot, you made it!" Daniel's voice broke through his thoughts, warm and slightly slurred from champagne. The groom, tie loosened and grin wide, clapped a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "Sarah and I had a bet you'd bail. You hate these things." "I said I'd come," Elliot replied, his smile a practiced curve, the one that had sealed billion-dollar deals and masked his disinterest in small talk about golf or weekend plans. It was a smile that fooled everyone, except, perhaps, Daniel, who'd known him when he was just a scrappy kid with big dreams and a bigger heart. "You should try this thing called fun," Daniel teased, gesturing to the dance floor, where couples swayed, their laughter a stark contrast to Elliot's tightly controlled world. "My cousin Laura's single, by the way. Stunning. Smart." "I'm good," Elliot cut in, his tone polite but final, a wall erected with surgical precision. He'd learned the hard way that relationships were just another form of merger, and he'd had enough failed partnerships to know he wasn't built for the long haul. Daniel studied him, his eyes narrowing with the insight of old friendship. You know, college Elliot would have been out there dancing, charming everyone. What happened to that guy? "He got successful," Elliot said, the words sharper than intended. He softened his voice, forcing warmth. "I'm happy for you, Daniel, really. But this isn't my scene." "It used to be," Daniel said, his voice tinged with something like regret. Before Elliot could respond, Sarah, radiant in her white gown, pulled Daniel away, leaving Elliot alone with the echo of that truth. College Elliot had believed in love, in late-night talks about dreams and fears, in a future where success didn't mean solitude. That was before he'd learned that empires demanded sacrifice, and love was the first casualty. He sipped his scotch, the burn grounding him as he calculated his exit. 25 minutes now. He'd congratulate Daniel again, nod at a few industry acquaintances, perhaps exchange a word about quarterly projections, and slip away. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a reminder of emails from Tokyo, a crisis in the European markets, and deals that couldn't wait. Work was his sanctuary, a place where emotions were irrelevant, filed away in mental folders labeled unnecessary and counterproductive. He was a master at compartmentalizing, at keeping the world at arm's length. Then a sound cut through the reception's joyful chaos, sharp and piercing, like a blade through silk. Not the clamor of celebration, but something softer, more visceral, a child's sob. It wasn't the demanding wail of a tantrum, but a quiet, heart-wrenching cry that spoke of genuine distress. Elliot's head snapped up, his businessman's instinct for problem-solving kicking in despite himself. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the source, a reflex he couldn't suppress. There, near a decorative fountain framed by lavender bushes, sat a small figure, barely visible in the fading light. A 5-year-old black boy, dressed in a tuxedo slightly too big, his shoulders shaking as he clutched a wilted flower. His dark eyes, framed by impossibly long lashes, glistened with tears, his small face etched with a sadness too heavy for his years. Elliot's first thought was to find the boy's parents. Someone else should handle this. Someone who knew how to comfort children, who had the right words, the right touch. He wasn't that person. His life was a fortress, built to avoid these messy emotional entanglements. Yet as he watched, guest after guest passed the boy without a glance, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice a child in pain. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve, his gaze darting around with the lost, desperate look of someone forgotten. Something twisted in Elliot's chest, a pang he didn't recognize. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself this wasn't his problem. He didn't know children, didn't know how to navigate their unpredictable emotions, but the boy's quiet sobs grew louder in his ears, drowning out the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. His feet moved before his mind could object, carrying him across the gravel path to the fountain. He stopped a few steps away, hesitating, his polished shoes scuffing the dirt. The boy looked up, his eyes locking onto Elliot's, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, a billionaire who'd forgotten how to feel, and a child who felt too much. Elliot crouched, his expensive suit forgotten as his knees brushed the ground. "Hey, little man," he said, his voice gentler than he'd thought possible. "You okay?" The boy blinked, tears streaking his cheeks, and Elliot felt something crack inside him, a fracture in the armor he'd spent years forging. This wasn't his scene, wasn't his life, but in that moment, he couldn't walk away. Elliot Vanderbilt crouched by the fountain, his tailored suit grazing the gravel, as the 5-year-old boy before him wiped tears with a trembling hand. The wedding reception's jazz notes and laughter faded into a distant hum, overshadowed by the boy's quiet sobs. The child's dark eyes, wide and glistening, held a vulnerability that pierced Elliot's carefully constructed walls. He'd spent years mastering detachment, building an empire where emotions were liabilities. Yet here he was, drawn to a stranger's pain like a moth to a flame. The boy clutched a wilted flower, its petals drooping like his small shoulders, and Elliot felt an unfamiliar urge to fix something that wasn't a balance sheet or a merger. "Hey, little man," Elliot said again, his voice soft, almost foreign to his ears. "What's got you so sad?" He kept his tone light, as if approaching a skittish animal, afraid he'd make things worse. The boy sniffled, his lower lip quivering with the effort to be brave. "I lost my flower," he whispered, barely audible over the quartet's saxophone. "It was supposed to be for Mommy, but I dropped it, and now I can't find her." Elliot's chest tightened, a sensation he couldn't name. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a silk pocket square, monogrammed worth more than most people's weekly groceries, and offered it to the boy. "Here," he said, "I've spilled worse things on worse days. Trust me." The boy hesitated, his small fingers brushing the fabric as if it might vanish, then took it, wiping his nose with careful reverence. "Thank you, mister," he mumbled, his voice a fragile thread. "You're nice." The words landed like a quiet detonation in Elliot's heart. Nice. When was the last time someone had called him that? In boardrooms, he was ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. To his employees, he was Mr. Vanderbilt, a name spoken with respect or fear, never warmth. He cleared his throat, pushing the thought aside. "I'm Elliot," he said, surprised by his openness. "What's your name?" Ethan, the boy replied, his eyes meeting Elliot's with a trust that felt both humbling and terrifying. Are you a king? You look fancy. Elliot chuckled, a rusty sound that caught him off guard. Not a king, he said. Just a guy who knows what it's like to feel lost sometimes. The words slipped out unbidden, raw and honest, and he blinked, startled by their truth. He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to let a crack form in his armor, but Ethan's sad eyes, framed by long lashes, seemed to pull truths from him he'd buried years ago. Ethan tilted his head, studying Elliot with a seriousness that belied his 5 years. You, system, years. His gaze dropped to the wilted flower in Ethan's hand, then back to the boy's face, searching for a way to ease his distress. Let's get you cleaned up, he said, his voice steady despite the unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. Can't you have a meeting? Your mom looks like you've been in a fight with a flower, right? Ethan giggled, a small, bright sound that cut through the evening's haze. The flower didn't fight back very hard, he said, his eyes sparkling with the first hint of joy. Elliot grinned, the expression feeling foreign on his face. Flowers are terrible at self-defense, he replied, gently straightening Ethan's bow tie, which hung askew on his tiny frame. He smoothed the boy's tight curls, his fingers careful, almost reverent, as if touching something precious. The act was simple, fixing a child's appearance, but it stirred something in Elliot, a flicker of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Mommy was talking to the lady in the white dress, Ethan said, clutching the pocket square like a treasure. But then there were so many people, and I got scared and came here because it's quiet. Elliot nodded, understanding the need for solitude all too well. He'd chosen this corner of the vineyard for the same reason, to escape the overwhelming tide of other people's happiness. We'll find her, he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. He stood brushing gravel from his knees and offered Ethan his hand. But first, let's make you look like the prince you are. Ethan took his hand, his small fingers warm and trusting, and Elliot felt a jolt, like a circuit closing after years of being unplugged. He led Ethan to the fountain's edge, dipping the pocket square in the cool water to gently wipe the tear streaks from the boy's cheeks. Ethan stood still, watching him with a quiet awe that made Elliot's throat tighten. There, Elliot said, stepping back to admire his work. Now you look like you're ready to rule a kingdom. Ethan's grin was wide, his earlier sadness fading like mist in sunlight. We're both princes, he declared solemnly, in the same kingdom. The words hit Elliot harder than they should have. When had he last felt like he belonged anywhere? His life was a fortress of his own making, each brick laid with ambition and fear of failure. Yet here, with this boy's small hand in his, he felt a flicker of connection, a sense of being part of something bigger than himself. He opened his mouth to respond, but a voice, sharp, desperate, and achingly familiar, cut through the moment like a blade. Ethan, baby, where are you? The call was a mother's plea, raw with panic, and Ethan's face lit up like a sunrise. That's my mommy, he cried, squeezing Elliot's hand before letting go. Elliot stood, his heart pounding, preparing to meet a grateful parent and slip back into his carefully curated solitude. He brushed off his suit, ready to nod politely and disappear, unaware that the next moment would shatter his world and awaken a part of him he'd long thought dead. The vineyard's warm evening air seemed to still as Ethan's joyful cry, "That's my mommy," echoed through the lavender-scented garden. Elliot Vanderbilt stood, brushing gravel from his knees, his tailored suit slightly rumpled from crouching by the fountain. The boy's small hand slipped from his, and Ethan's tiny figure darted toward the voice, leaving Elliot to prepare for a polite exchange with a grateful parent. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex to regain control, expecting to nod, accept thanks, and retreat to his solitary world. But as a figure emerged from behind the lavender bushes, the world tilted beneath him, the jazz quartet's notes fading into a distant hum. His breath caught, sharp and painful, as recognition hit like a physical blow. Kira Thompson stood frozen on the garden path, her dark eyes wide with disbelief, her radiant brown skin catching the golden glow of the setting sun. Her short, coiled hair framed her face, accentuating high cheekbones and full lips that had haunted Elliot's dreams for 5 years. Her emerald green dress clung to her curves, elegant yet approachable, a stark contrast to the polished women he'd brushed off at countless galas. She was more breathtaking than he remembered, but the shock in her gaze mirrored his own, laced with something fiercer, protective fury. Elliot? Her voice was a whisper, trembling with a storm of emotions, as if his name alone had reopened a wound she'd spent years stitching closed. Elliot's mind reeled, his billionaire's composure crumbling. 5 years ago, Kira had been his everything, the woman who'd laughed with him through late-night talks, who'd seen the man beneath the ambition, who'd made him believe love could coexist with his dreams. Then, without a word, she'd vanished, leaving a void he'd filled with work, deals, and a fortress of detachment. Now she stood before him, as real as the pain in his chest, and he couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare at the woman who'd once held his heart. "Mommy, this is Elliot." Ethan's voice broke the silence, bright and oblivious to the tension. He wrapped his small arms around Kira's legs, clutching Elliot's silk pocket square like a trophy. "He helped me when I was sad and gave me his fancy napkin." His grin was wide, his earlier tears forgotten, but Kira's eyes never left Elliot's face. A tempest swirled in her gaze, shock, fear, and something deeper, quickly buried under a mother's instinct. "Ethan, honey," Kira said, her voice tight but gentle, "go sit on that bench for a minute, okay? Mommy needs to talk to Elliot." Her words were soft, but the edge in them cut like glass. Ethan, sensing the shift in the air with a child's intuition, nodded and skipped to the nearby bench, still holding the pocket square, his small figure a beacon of innocence in the charged moment. The silence between Elliot and Kira stretched like a chasm, heavy with 5 years of unanswered questions. The wedding's joy, clinking glasses, distant laughter, felt like another world, irrelevant against the weight of their shared history. Elliot's heart pounded, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. Ethan's dark eyes, his tight curls, the way he tilted his head when he spoke. They were mirrors of Elliot's own childhood photos, echoes of a face he'd seen in old family albums. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, stealing his breath. "He's mine, isn't he?" His voice cracked, raw and unsteady, the question hanging between them like a guillotine. Kira's silence was answer enough. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a flicker of pain in her eyes. She crossed her arms, a defensive gesture, as if bracing for a battle she'd fought in her mind 1,000 times. Elliot took a step closer, his polished exterior forgotten, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kira, he's mine." It wasn't a question this time, but a plea, a desperate need to confirm the truth that was reshaping his world. Her eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill, but she held them back with a strength that both awed and gutted him. "You don't get to do this," she said finally, her voice low, trembling with restrained fury. "You don't get to walk back in and claim him like he's some deal you closed." Her words were a dagger, sharp and precise, cutting through the haze of shock. She glanced at Ethan, ensuring he was out of earshot, then stepped closer, her gaze searing. "You weren't there, Elliot. You were never there." The accusation landed like a blow, true and unrelenting. 5 years ago, he'd been consumed by his startup's rise, chasing deals that built his empire while Kira faded into the background of his life. He'd missed dinners, cut conversations short for calls, promised to be present only to disappear into his office. But this was different. "You didn't tell me," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't suppress. "You kept him from me." Kira's composure wavered, her hands trembling as she tucked a coil of hair behind her ear. "I had to," she said, her voice breaking. "I had to protect him." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of choices made in pain, and Elliot felt the ground shift beneath him, his empire meaningless against the reality of a son he'd never known. He shook his head, struggling to find words to bridge the gap between them. "I would have tried," he said, his voice breaking. "I would have been there if you'd given me a chance." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. Would he have? 5 years ago, he'd been so consumed by his goals, so terrified of failing, that he'd pushed away everything that mattered. Kira had been his anchor, his heart, and he'd let her slip through his fingers. "You had chances, Elliot," Kira said, her voice softer now, heavy with exhaustion. "Every missed dinner, every broken promise, every time you chose work over me, you were choosing. I just finally accepted it." She paused, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for the man she'd once loved, the one who'd read poetry to her under starlit skies, who'd dreamed of a life beyond wealth. "I couldn't let Ethan grow up waiting for a father who might never show up." Elliot's throat burned, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was undeniable. He'd chosen ambition over love, success over presence, and now he stood face to face with the consequences. A son he'd never known, a woman he'd never stopped loving, and a life he'd built on the ashes of what could have been. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting foreign, inadequate. "I didn't know how much I was losing." Kira's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but her resolve held firm. "Sorry doesn't change the past," she said, glancing at Ethan, who was now folding the pocket square into shapes. "It doesn't change what I had to do to protect him." The air between them was heavy, charged with the ghosts of their shared history, and Elliot knew that whatever came next, it would take more than words to bridge the divide. The vineyard's twilight deepened, the soft glow of string lights casting a warm halo over the garden path where Elliot Vanderbilt and Kira Thompson stood, their shared history a heavy curtain between them. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, sat on the nearby bench, folding and unfolding Elliot's silk pocket square with the earnest concentration of a 5-year-old. The wedding reception's distant laughter and jazz notes felt like a world apart, irrelevant against the seismic shift in Elliot's reality. His son, sat just feet away, a living testament to a life he'd never known, a truth Kira had guarded with fierce resolve. Elliot's heart pounded, his billionaire's armor cracked wide open, exposing a vulnerability he'd spent years burying. He wanted to reach across the chasm, to undo the pain he'd caused, but Kira's words, sharp, true, still echoed. "I couldn't let Ethan grow up waiting for a father who might never show up." Elliot's gaze dropped to Ethan, the boy's dark curls catching the light, his small fingers tracing the monogram on the pocket square. Something stirred in Elliot, a longing so fierce it threatened to unravel him. He knelt beside the bench, his polished shoes scuffing the gravel, and softened his voice to a tone he barely recognized. "Hey, buddy," he said, meeting Ethan's wide, trusting eyes. "Would you like it if I came around sometimes? Maybe we could play or read stories together?" Ethan's face lit up, a sunrise breaking through clouds. "Can we play astronauts?" he asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. "I have a rocket ship at home. It's red and it goes whoosh." He waved his arms, mimicking a launch, and Elliot felt a smile tug at his lips, genuine and unforced, a rarity in his calculated world. "I don't know much about astronauts," Elliot admitted, his tone warm, almost confessional. "But I'd love to learn. Think you could teach me?" Ethan nodded solemnly, as if entrusted with a sacred mission. "I'll teach you. You just say, 'blast off,' and pretend you're flying to the moon." His grin was infectious, and for a moment, Elliot forgot the boardrooms, the deals, the empire that had defined him. He laughed, a rusty, unguarded sound that echoed in his chest, startling him with its honesty. When had he last laughed like that, free of pretense or strategy? He glanced at Kira, standing a few steps away, her arms still crossed, her dark eyes watching him with a mix of caution and something softer, harder to name. He stood, brushing gravel from his knees, and faced her, his heart a tangle of hope and fear. "Kira," he said, his voice low, "I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I hurt you more than I can ever understand. But I want to try. For him, for you, for the man I used to be before I lost my way." Kira's expression wavered, her lips parting as if to speak, but she held back, her gaze searching his face. The weight of their past hung heavy, missed dinners, broken promises, the slow erosion of their love under the pressure of his ambition. "You hurt me, Elliot," she said finally, her voice quiet but piercing. "More than I thought it was possible to be hurt. You made me feel like I was invisible, like I was begging for scraps of your time. Elliot swallowed, the truth of her words a bitter pill. He'd been so consumed by his drive to succeed, to prove himself against a world that had doubted him, that he'd failed to see the woman he loved slipping away. I know, he said, his voice thick with regret. I was blind, Kira. I thought I was building a future, but I was breaking everything that mattered. I don't have the right to ask for anything, but please, let me try to be a father to him. Let me be better. Kira's eyes flickered to Ethan, who was now pretending the pocket square was a cape, swooping it through the air with a soft whoosh. Her expression softened, but her voice remained firm. If you do this, Elliot, it has to be real. No halfway, no disappearing when a deal needs closing or a boardroom calls. Ethan deserves a father who's present, not a ghost who shows up when it's convenient. Elliot nodded, his throat tight. He reached into his pocket, feeling the buzz of his phone. Missed calls, urgent emails, the relentless demands of his empire. For the first time in years, he hadn't checked it, hadn't even thought to. I haven't looked at my phone once, he said, almost in wonder. It's been buzzing for an hour, and I didn't care. I don't want to be that man anymore. The one who puts work before everything else. Kira's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through her guarded expression. That's a start, she said, her voice softer now, tinged with cautious hope. She studied him, as if weighing his words against the years of disappointment, searching for the man she'd once loved, the one who'd laughed with her under starlit skies, who'd promised her a life of shared dreams. But words aren't enough, Elliot. You have to show it, every day. I will, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. Being a father, being present, it was uncharted territory, more daunting than any hostile takeover. But looking at Ethan, at the boy's unguarded trust, he felt a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. I want to be part of his life, Kira, however long it takes to earn your trust. Kira's lips curved into a tentative smile, small but real, a crack in the wall between them. She glanced at Ethan, then back at Elliot, her eyes glistening. We'll see, she said simply, but there was a warmth in her tone that hadn't been there before, a faint promise of possibility. For the first time, Elliot felt a spark of hope, not the calculated optimism of a businessman, but something raw, terrifying, and alive. The vineyard's twilight had softened into a velvet dusk, the string lights weaving a delicate glow across the wedding reception. The air carried the sweet scent of lavender and the faint clink of glasses. But for Elliot Vanderbilt, the world had narrowed to the small table where he sat with Kira Thompson and their son Ethan. The boys' chatter filled the space between them, a bright thread weaving through the tension of their earlier confrontation. Ethan, his tiny tuxedo slightly askew, clutched a fork smeared with chocolate frosting, his dark eyes sparkling as he described his imaginary rocket ship. Kira's tentative smile lingered, a fragile bridge over the chasm of their past. And Elliot felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a thawing of the icy walls he'd built around his heart. Ethan waved the silk pocket square, Elliot's, now a child's treasure, like a flag of victory. And then my rocket goes whoosh to the moon, he declared, smearing more frosting on his cheek. Elliot leaned forward, his billionaire's polish forgotten, and wiped the mess with a napkin, his touch gentle, almost reverent. The act was simple, but it anchored him, grounding him in a moment that felt more real than any boardroom triumph. Kira watched, her dark eyes softening, a flicker of recognition passing through them, as if glimpsing the man she'd once loved beneath the layers of ambition. You're good with him, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the hum of the reception. She tucked a coil of hair behind her ear, a gesture Elliot remembered from quieter days when they'd shared dreams under starlit skies. He trusts you already. Elliot glanced at Ethan, who was now stacking sugar cubes into a wobbly tower, oblivious to the weight of the moment. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice low, raw with honesty. I've never been around kids. I'm terrified I'll mess this up. The confession felt like shedding armor, leaving him exposed, but Ethan's grin as he toppled the sugar cubes made the vulnerability worth it. Kira's smile widened, tired but warm. None of us know at first, she said. You just love them. The rest figures itself out. She paused, her gaze steady. You listened to him, Elliot. You treated him like a person, not a problem to solve. That's more than most start with. Her words settled over him, a quiet validation that stirred something deep within. He looked at Ethan, the boy's curls catching the light, his laughter a melody that drowned out the buzz of his phone, still ignored in his pocket. For an hour, the demands of his empire, emails from Tokyo, calls from investors, had been silent, irrelevant. I haven't checked my phone once, he said, almost in awe. It's been buzzing, and I didn't even think about it. Kira's eyes widened, a spark of surprise breaking through her guarded expression. That's new, she said, her tone light but laced with meaning. The Elliot I knew would have been halfway through 3 calls by now. She leaned back, studying him, as if searching for proof that this change was real, not just a fleeting moment born of shock. He met her gaze, his blue eyes earnest. I don't want to be that man anymore, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. The one who's always running, always choosing work over this. He gestured to Ethan, to the table, to the fragile possibility of a family he'd never known he had. Sitting here, with you and him, it's the first time in years I've felt like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Kira's expression softened, her arms uncrossing, her hands resting lightly on the table. That's what love does, she said softly. It makes you more yourself than you ever thought possible. Her words carried the weight of their shared past, of nights when they'd believed love could conquer anything. But there was caution in her eyes, a reminder of the pain he'd caused. But love isn't enough if you can't stay for it, Elliot. Not then and not now. He nodded, the truth of her words a quiet ache. I know, he said. I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to balance it all. Work, life, this. But I know I want to try. I want to be here, for him. He glanced at Ethan, who was now drawing invisible stars on the tablecloth with his finger, humming a tune only he knew. And for you, if you'll let me. Kira's lips parted, but she didn't speak, her eyes searching his face for the man she'd once known, the one who'd laughed freely, who dreamed of a life beyond wealth. We'll see, she said finally, her voice a whisper of possibility. It's not just about wanting, Elliot. It's about showing up every day, no matter what. Her gaze flickered to Ethan, then back to him, a silent challenge to prove himself. Ethan's voice broke the moment, bright and insistent. Mr. Elliot, look, my tower fell, but I'm going to build a spaceship now. He pushed the sugar cubes into a chaotic pile, his grin wide and unself-conscious. Elliot laughed, the sound genuine, rusty, like a door long closed creaking open. That's a fine spaceship, Captain Ethan, he said, leaning closer. Got room for a co-pilot? Ethan nodded eagerly. You can come to the moon with me, but you gotta say blast off real loud. Elliot obliged, his blast off, earning a delighted giggle from Ethan and a soft, surprised smile from Kira. For a moment, the 3 of them were a unit, bound by laughter and the flicker of something new. A spark of hope that felt fragile but alive, glowing like the string lights above them. The vineyard's dusk had deepened into a starlit night, the string lights twinkling like constellations above the wedding reception. The air buzzed with the clink of glasses and the soft croon of the jazz quartet, but for Elliot Vanderbilt, the world had shrunk to the small, joyful orbit of Ethan, who stood before him, eyes wide with mischief. The boy, his tiny tuxedo dusted with sugar from a toppled cube tower, tugged at Elliot's hand, his voice a bright spark in the evening's warmth. Mr. Elliot, dance with me, Ethan demanded, his curls bouncing as he hopped in place. You gotta put me on your shoulders and spin. Elliot hesitated, his billionaire's poise faltering. Dancing wasn't in his repertoire. Boardrooms, not dance floors, were his domain. Yet Ethan's infectious grin, so unguarded and pure, pulled at something deep within him, a part he'd long buried under layers of ambition and control. Kira Thompson sat at the table, her emerald green dress catching the light as she watched, her expression a blend of caution and curiosity. Her earlier words, "It's about showing up every day," echoed in Elliot's mind, a challenge he felt determined to meet. He knelt, his tailored suit forgotten, and grinned at Ethan. "I don't think I know how to dance with a 5-year-old, Captain," he said, his voice warm with a playfulness that felt foreign yet exhilarating. "You'll have to show me." Ethan's face lit up, as if handed the keys to a spaceship. "It's easy. You put me up here," he patted Elliot's shoulders, "and spin like we're flying." Before Elliot could overthink it, Ethan scrambled up, his small hands gripping Elliot's blonde hair with fearless trust. Elliot stood, steadying the boy, and felt a surge of something he couldn't name. Joy, perhaps, raw and unfiltered, like a memory from a life he'd forgotten. He spun slowly at first, testing the weight of Ethan's laughter above him, then faster, the boy's giggles ringing out like bells, drowning out the reception's hum. The dance floor swirled around them, a blur of elegant dresses and clinking champagne flutes, but Elliot was lost in the moment, Ethan's delight a beacon pulling him from the shadows of his guarded existence. Guests turned to watch, some with amused smiles, others with curious glances. But their stares meant nothing. For the first time in years, Elliot wasn't performing for an audience, wasn't calculating his next move. He was simply there, spinning his son under the starlit sky, feeling the weight of the world lift with each peal of Ethan's laughter. "Faster, Mr. Elliot," Ethan squealed, his hands clutching tighter. Elliot obliged, his laughter bubbling up, rusty but genuine, a sound he barely recognized. The boy's joy was contagious, a spark that ignited something long dormant in Elliot's chest. When had he last felt this free? Not since college, perhaps, when he danced with Kira under dim streetlights, believing love could conquer anything. The memory flickered, but he pushed it aside, focusing on Ethan, on the weight of his small body, the trust in his grip. Daniel, the groom, appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his tie loose and his grin wide. "Now, this is the Elliot I remember," he said, clapping a hand on Elliot's shoulder as he slowed his spins. "Who's the little guy stealing the show?" Elliot caught his breath, Ethan still perched on his shoulders, and met Daniel's eyes. "This is Ethan," he said, the words feeling surreal yet right. "My son." The admission hit like a thunderbolt, solidifying the truth he was still grappling with. "I just found out." Daniel's eyes widened, his grin faltering into astonishment. "Your son? Man, you've been holding out on me." Before he could ask more, Ethan tugged at Elliot's hair, demanding, "Spin again!" And Elliot laughed, obliging, letting the moment carry him away. Daniel shook his head, chuckling, and melted back into the crowd, leaving Elliot and Ethan to their impromptu dance. For the next hour, Elliot surrendered to Ethan's world. They played peekaboo behind a tablecloth, Ethan's giggles erupting each time Elliot found him. The boys shared endless stories about his red rocket ship, a neighbor's cat he swore was magic, and a superhero who could fly to the moon. Elliot listened, really listened, hanging on every word as if they were the most important deal he'd ever negotiated. Ethan's questions came fast and fearless. "Why's the sky blue? Do rich people eat broccoli? Do you know any astronaut songs?" Elliot answered with a patience he didn't know he possessed, each response drawing him deeper into a role he'd never imagined. "Father." Kira watched from the table, her expression softening as Ethan showed off the wedding cake's sparkler candles, declaring them real magic. During a quiet moment, as Ethan darted off to inspect the dessert table with a new friend, she leaned closer to Elliot, her voice low. "You're good with him," she said, her eyes searching his face. "You're patient. You make him feel important." Elliot shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just following his lead," he said. "He's incredible. How did you do this alone?" The question slipped out, raw and unguarded, a glimpse into the awe and guilt swirling within him. Kira's smile was tired but proud, her gaze drifting to Ethan. "You do what you have to," she said. "You love them so much that everything else, fear, exhaustion, doubt, becomes background noise." She paused, her eyes meeting his again, steady and unflinching. "But it's hard, Elliot. Harder than you can imagine. And if you want to be part of this, it can't be half-hearted. He deserves all of you." Elliot nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. His phone, still silent in his pocket, was a testament to his shift in priorities, but he knew it was only a start. "I want to be here," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "I want to be the father he deserves, the man you once believed in." The words were a vow, fragile but resolute, and as Kira's eyes held his, he saw a flicker of the trust they'd once shared, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could earn it back. The vineyard's starlit night shimmered with the glow of string lights, their soft radiance weaving a dreamlike canopy over the wedding reception. The jazz quartet's final notes faded, replaced by the murmur of departing guests and the clink of glasses being cleared. Elliot Vanderbilt stood at the edge of the garden, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, his blonde hair tousled from Ethan's playful tugs. The boy, now drowsy, leaned against his leg, clutching the silk pocket square like a talisman, his small body warm and heavy with the weight of a long evening. Kira Thompson stood beside them, her emerald green dress catching the light, her dark eyes reflecting a cautious hope that both anchored and unnerved Elliot. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and the promise of something new, a fragile possibility that felt more precious than any deal he'd ever closed. Ethan yawned, his curls brushing Elliot's hand as he nestled closer. "Mr. Elliot," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep, "do you know any moon stories?" The question, innocent and unguarded, pierced Elliot's heart, stirring a longing to be more than a fleeting figure in this boy's life. He knelt, his polished shoes sinking into the soft earth, and smiled, his voice soft. "Not yet, Captain, but I'll learn some for you. Maybe next time we can tell one together." Ethan's eyes fluttered, a sleepy grin spreading across his face, and Elliot felt a surge of purpose, as if every contract he'd ever signed had been practiced for this moment. Kira's voice broke the quiet, gentle but firm. "We should get going. Ethan has school tomorrow." She adjusted the strap of her purse, her movements deliberate, as if grounding herself in the practicality of routine. Elliot stood, Ethan's small hand still in his, and felt a pang of reluctance. The night had changed him, cracked open the fortress he'd built around his heart, and the thought of returning to his sterile penthouse, alone with the hum of unanswered emails, felt unbearable. "Can I see you both again?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Kira met his gaze, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing his sincerity against years of broken promises. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hesitating before tapping the screen. "Call me," she said finally, offering her number. "We'll start slow. Maybe coffee this week." Elliot entered her number into his phone, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. This wasn't a merger, not a deal to be negotiated with charm and strategy, but a contract of trust, one he knew he'd have to earn. "Kira," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what I did tonight with Ethan, that's the man I want to be. Not the CEO, not the one who let you down, but the one who shows up." Her lips curved into a real smile, the first unshadowed by caution, and it lit her face like the sunrise Ethan had described in his rocket ship tales. "Our son deserves that man," she said softly, her voice a blend of challenge and hope. "But it's not just about tonight, Elliot. It's about every day after this." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a vow. "I know," he said. "I'll show you, however long it takes." The promise felt like the most important he'd ever made, not because of its stakes, but because of its simplicity. A commitment to be present, to be the father Ethan needed, the man Kira might trust again. Ethan stirred, rubbing his eyes. "Mommy, is Mr. Elliot coming with us?" His voice was a sleepy mumble, but the hope in it tugged at Elliot's heart. Kira knelt beside him, smoothing his curls. "Not tonight, baby," she said, her tone gentle, "but maybe soon." Ethan nodded, content, and reached for Elliot's hand, squeezing it with a trust that felt like a gift. As they walked toward the parking lot, Ethan's small hand in his, Elliot felt the world shift beneath him. The reception's lights faded behind them, but the warmth of this moment burned brighter. Kira carried Ethan's jacket, her steps steady, and Elliot matched her pace, savoring the quiet rhythm of their trio. At the car, Ethan climbed into the back seat, waving sleepily through the window. "Bye, Mr. Elliot," he called, his voice muffled. "Don't forget the moon stories." "I won't, Captain," Elliot replied, his throat tight. He met Kira's eyes over the car's roof, her expression a mix of exhaustion and possibility. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but sincere, "for letting me be here tonight." She studied him, her gaze piercing. "Don't make me regret it," she said, but there was a softness in her tone, a crack in the wall she'd built. She slid into the driver's seat, and as the car pulled away, Ethan's small hand pressed against the window, waving until they disappeared into the night. Elliot stood alone in the parking lot, the hum of the reception now a distant echo. His phone buzzed in his pocket, missed calls, urgent emails, the relentless demands of his empire. But for the first time in years, he didn't care. He pulled it out, switched it off, and let the silence envelop him. The act was small but seismic, a declaration that his priorities had shifted. He wasn't the man who let ambition eclipse love, not anymore. He was a father, a man with a second chance, and he'd fight for it with every ounce of his being. As he walked to his car, the stars above seemed brighter, their light a reminder of Ethan's magic sparklers and Kira's cautious smile. Tomorrow he'd begin reshaping his life, delegating deals, carving out time for coffee dates and bedtime stories, and learning to be present. Success, he realized, wasn't the empire he'd built. It was the family he might reclaim, the man he could become. The vineyard faded behind him, but the promise of a new beginning burned in his chest, a beacon guiding him toward a future he'd never dared to dream. As Elliot, Kira, and Ethan's story fades into the starlit night, we're left with a powerful reminder that love and second chances can transform even the hardest hearts. What did this tale stir in you? Would you take a chance on rebuilding trust like Kira, or strive to change like Elliot? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our Golden Heart Narratives family for more tales that spark the soul. Thank you for listening, for opening your heart to this journey of redemption and hope. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to choose love over ambition. Until next time, keep your heart open to the magic of new beginnings. See you in the next story.